The copper tang of blood hit my tongue before I even realized my lip was bleeding. I stared at the reddish-brown smear on the silk fibers of the Egyptian cotton. It looked like a map of a country I didn't recognize. A dark, jagged territory of betrayal. My husband sat on the edge of the bed with his back to me. His shoulder blades were sharp, like knives tucked under his skin. Outside the window, the Pacific Ocean crashed against the California cliffs with a violence that matched the drumming in my chest. This was my wedding night. The beginning of my forever. But as I touched the damp edge of that stain, I knew the man I married was already gone. I looked at the heavy mahogany door. It was locked from the outside. I could hear Margaret's breathing through the wood. Soft. Rhythmic. Triumphant. If you've ever felt the person you trust most slip through your fingers in a single second, hit the like button so I know I'm not alone in this darkness. The day had started with the scent of expensive jasmine and the sterile salt of the coast. I am Claire Miller. 26 years old. A woman who believed in the structural integrity of a promise. I am a corporate auditor by trade. I live for the balance sheet. I find the discrepancies. I track the missing cents. Ethan was my only deviation from logic. He was a pediatric surgeon. A man who spent his days repairing tiny hearts. He was kind. He was calm. He was the golden boy of the West Coast medical scene. We met during a charity gala for the hospital. He spilled a glass of vintage Bordeaux on my white dress and spent the next 3 hours explaining the molecular structure of the stain. He was brilliant. He was safe. Or so I thought until the moment we stood at the altar and I saw his mother's hands. Margaret Miller didn't clap when we were announced. She gripped her pearls until her knuckles turned the color of bone. She wore a dress that was just a few shades too close to white. Champagne, she called it. But in the sunlight, it was bridal. Throughout the reception, she didn't drink. She watched. She navigated the room with the precision of a high-frequency trader. She was calculating the ROI of every smile I gave her son. Every time Ethan leaned in to kiss me, she would appear. A glass of water. A rogue lint on his tuxedo. A reminder about a distant relative. Her presence was a physical weight. A humidity that made it hard to breathe. By midnight, the exhaustion had settled into my marrow. My feet ached from the heels. My face hurt from the performance of joy. I wanted the sanctuary of our suite. I wanted the man I loved to finally be mine, without the shadow of his mother looming over the champagne tower. The suite was a masterclass in luxury. Floor-to-ceiling glass. A bed that cost more than my first car. I went to the vanity to peel off the layers of the day. I removed the diamonds. I wiped away the waterproof mascara. I was stripping down to the real Claire. I heard the door click. I expected Ethan. I expected his arms around my waist. Instead, I saw Margaret in the mirror. She wasn't wearing her champagne dress anymore. She was in a silk robe. It was dark. Like a bruise. She was swaying. Her hair was undone. She held a pillow to her chest like a shield. She smelled of gin and something sharp. Something chemical. Ethan followed her in. His face was a mask of practiced neutrality. The kind of face a doctor uses when the prognosis is terminal. "Mom is very drunk," Ethan said. His voice was flat. Devoid of the warmth he'd used in his vows just 6 hours earlier. He told me she needed to lie down. He said the noise downstairs was too much for her nerves. I looked at Margaret. Her eyes were glassy. Red-rimmed. But as she leaned against the doorframe, her gaze caught mine. For a split second, the veil dropped. There was no alcohol in those eyes. There was only a cold, predatory intelligence. She wasn't drunk. She was performing. I reached out to help her. I told her I'd walk her to the guest wing. I told her the sofa in the living area was incredibly comfortable. But Ethan stepped between us. His hand on my arm was firm. Too firm. "Let her stay here," he whispered. "It's just a wedding, Claire. It's just one night." The words felt like a physical blow. It wasn't just a wedding. It was our wedding. Our first night as a unit. Our first act of domesticity. But as I looked at the two of them, I realized I was the intruder. I was the third wheel in a long-standing arrangement. I grabbed my pillow. I didn't argue. I didn't want to be the hysterical bride. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a scene. I retreated to the sofa in the adjoining room. I laid there in the dark. The silence of the house was deafening. I could hear the murmur of voices from behind the bedroom door. A low, rhythmic humming. It sounded like a lullaby. I fell into a feverish sleep around 4 in the morning. When I woke at 6, the sun was a gray smear on the horizon. I walked back to the bedroom to wake my husband. I pushed the door open. The air in the room was thick. Cloying. I saw them. Ethan was on his back. Margaret was curled next to him. Her head was on his shoulder. My side of the bed was occupied by the woman who had sworn to protect him. I walked to the edge of the bed. My heart was a frantic bird in a cage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the sheets off. But then I saw it. The stain. It wasn't a spill. It wasn't wine. It was a dark, drying blotch near the center of the bed. It had a copper scent. The scent of an open wound. I reached out. I touched the fabric. The edges were still slightly tacky. My mind raced through the possibilities. A nosebleed? A cut? But as I looked at Margaret's arm, I saw her sleeve was pulled down tight. She wasn't sleeping. Her eyelids flickered. She knew I was there. She was waiting for me to find it. She wanted me to see the mark she had left on our marriage before it had even begun. I stood there for an eternity. The clock on the nightstand ticked with a mechanical cruelty. Every second felt like a year. I looked at Ethan. He was still. Too still. His breathing was shallow. He was holding himself in a state of suspended animation. He was hiding. He was a grown man, a surgeon who saved lives, and he was hiding from his wife in the shadow of his mother. I looked back at the stain. Why would there be blood? My auditor's brain started connecting dots I didn't want to see. The locked door. The fake intoxication. The obsession. I realized that Margaret wasn't just a controlling mother. She was an architect of a very specific kind of misery. She had built a fortress around her son, and she was currently laying the foundation for my destruction. I didn't say a word. I backed out of the room. My bare feet made no sound on the plush carpet. I went to the laundry room. I needed to see the remnants of the night. I found the old sheets from the guest room. They were bundled in the bottom of the hamper. I pulled them out. They were pristine. White. Untouched. This confirmed it. Margaret hadn't even attempted to sleep in the guest wing. This was a planned infiltration. I went back to the kitchen. I started making coffee. My hands were steady. That's the thing about a crisis. Once the initial shock passes, the professional takes over. I began to audit my life. I began to look for the missing pieces of Ethan's history. As the coffee dripped, I remembered something. A small detail from our engagement party. Ethan's father had died when Ethan was 10. A car accident. Margaret had spoken about it with a strange kind of pride. She said she had been the only one who could save Ethan from the trauma. She said they were a team. I looked at the wedding photos sitting on the counter. In every single one, Margaret was slightly in the frame. A shoulder. A hand. A shadow. She was the ghost in the machine. I walked back toward the bedroom, but I stopped at the door to the attic. It was a heavy oak door. It had been locked since the day I moved in. I felt the handle. It was cold. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare key I'd found in Ethan's desk weeks ago. The lock turned with a heavy thud. The air in the attic was stale. It smelled of dust and old paper. A single bulb hung from the ceiling. Under its yellow glare, I saw the walls. They were covered. Thousands of photographs. All of Ethan. Ethan as a baby. Ethan at his graduation. Ethan in the operating room. But there was something wrong. In every photo where someone else was present, their face had been meticulously removed. Cut out with a surgical precision. Even my face. In our engagement photo, my eyes had been scratched out with a needle. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. This wasn't a mother's love. This was a ledger of obsession. This was a collection of assets. I found the diary on a small wooden table. It was bound in black leather. The pages were thin. Translucent. I opened the first page. The handwriting was elegant. Sharp. It spoke of the accident. It spoke of the father who wanted to take Ethan away to a boarding school in England. The father who wanted to break the bond. The entry was dated the night before the crash. It said, "He will not take what is mine. I will ensure we are the only ones left." My breath hitched. I flipped forward. To the day Ethan met me. The ink became thicker. More aggressive. "She is a parasite," the entry read. "She thinks she can audit our life. She thinks she can balance the books. She doesn't know that I am the only one who keeps the accounts." I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew who it was. I could smell the jasmine and the gin. "You weren't supposed to find this," Margaret said. Her voice was no longer sweet. It was a low, guttural rasp. It was the voice of the woman who had left a stain on my wedding sheets just to prove she could. I felt the weight of her presence. I knew that in this house, the rules of the outside world didn't apply. I was in her domain now. I looked down at the diary. At the photo of me with the ruined face. I realized then that the blood on the sheets wasn't an accident. It was a ritual. It was a marking of territory. And I was the prey. I slowly turned to face her. She was holding a pair of surgical scissors. The light glinted off the steel. She smiled. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. She looked at me and whispered, "Do you really think you're the first one who tried to change the balance?" I didn't blink. I couldn't afford to. In the world of high-stakes litigation and financial auditing, the person who flinches first loses the leverage. Margaret stood in the doorway of that cramped attic like a gargoyle carved from ice and resentment. The surgical scissors in her hand weren't a threat. They were a statement. She held them with the casual ease of someone who knew exactly where the major arteries resided. My mind began to calculate the risk. The exit was behind her. The stairs were narrow. The house was a labyrinth designed to keep people in, not let them out. I looked at the steel blades and then back at her eyes. They were wide. Unblinking. Completely sober. "You think you are special, Claire," she whispered. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "You think because you have a ring and a contract that you have a claim. But I am the one who drafted the terms of his existence. I am the one who balanced the scales when his father tried to tip them." I looked at the wall of defaced photos behind me. I saw the jagged edges where my own face had been excised from the record. This was a total erasure. A hostile takeover of a human soul. I realized then that the reddish-brown stain on my wedding sheets hadn't been a wound. It had been a signature. She had marked the bed like a predator marks its kill. I took a step forward. I didn't let my hands shake. If you've ever looked into the eyes of someone and realized they aren't playing by the same rules of reality as the rest of us, hit the like button. Because in that moment, I knew I wasn't dealing with a mother-in-law. I was dealing with a liquidator. She didn't want to share Ethan. She wanted to dissolve me. She wanted to turn me into another footnote in the diary of her obsession. I felt the weight of the black leather book in my hand. It was the only evidence of the truth. The only proof that the accident years ago wasn't an act of God, but an act of Margaret. She moved with a sudden, fluid grace that defied her age. She didn't lunge. She drifted. She was cutting off my air. Closing the distance. I backed toward the small attic window. The glass was old. Rippled. Outside, the fog was rolling in from the Pacific, swallowing the cliffs and the road. I was alone. Ethan was downstairs, trapped in a fugue state of his own making. He was the golden boy. The surgeon. The man who could fix anything but himself. I realized I couldn't count on him to burst through that door and save me. He had been trained since birth to look away from the blood. I looked at the scissors again. They were pointed down. Professional. Precise. Why the sheets, Margaret? I asked. My voice was steady. A cold, clinical inquiry. I needed to keep her talking. I needed to find the gap in her logic. She paused. Her head tilted to the side. A bird-like gesture. It's a message, she said. It's the color of the end. It's what happens when people try to take what belongs to me. He is my heart. And you don't take a heart out of a body and expect it to keep beating. You are an infection, Claire. And I am the cure. She took another step. The yellow light cast long, distorted shadows across the wall of faceless photos. I felt the edge of the table press into my lower back. There was no more room to retreat. I looked at the diary. I looked at the woman who had spent 16 years perfecting the art of possession. I realized that the only way to beat a person who has nothing to lose is to show them exactly what they've already lost. I opened the diary to the page about the accident. I held it up. He knows, I said. Ethan knows you let his father die. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. Margaret's face didn't crumble. It didn't change. It simply froze. The mask didn't slip. It became the reality. She looked at the handwriting. Her handwriting. The confession she had written in a moment of solitary triumph or perhaps a moment of profound weakness. The scissors trembled. Just a fraction of a millimeter. But in an audit, a fraction is everything. It's the thread you pull to unravel the entire fabric. I saw the crack in her foundation. I saw the fear beneath the steel. He would never believe you, she hissed. Her voice was losing its composure. It was cracking at the edges. He needs me. He is fragile. I made him. I whispered back that she didn't make him. She broke him. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I walked straight toward her. I walked until the point of those scissors was inches from my throat. I looked her directly in the eyes. I am a professional, Margaret, I said. I deal in facts. And the fact is, you are bankrupt. You have spent everything you had to keep him, and now you have zero balance. She didn't strike. She didn't move. She seemed to shrink under the weight of the truth. I brushed past her. My shoulder hit hers. She felt like stone. Cold. Lifeless. I walked out of the attic and down the narrow stairs. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a hammer. I didn't look back. I went straight to the master bedroom. Ethan was sitting up now. He was staring at the stain on the sheets. He looked like a child lost in a department store. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the man I loved. I saw the victim. I grabbed my suitcase. I didn't pack carefully. I shoved clothes in. I grabbed my passport. My laptop. The essentials of a life in transit. Ethan didn't move. He didn't ask what I was doing. He knew. The air in the room was still thick with the scent of copper and jasmine. It was the smell of a crime scene. I stood by the door. Ethan, I said. His name felt heavy in my mouth. Like a stone. I am leaving. You can stay here in this bed with your mother, or you can walk out that door with me. But you have 10 seconds to decide before the accounts are closed forever. He looked at me. His eyes were searching for a way out. A way to stay safe and still have his life. But there is no such thing as a partial bankruptcy. You are either in or you are out. I started to count. 1. 2. I heard Margaret's footsteps on the stairs. They were slow. Deliberate. 3. 4. Ethan looked at the door. He looked at the window. He looked at the stain on the white silk. 5. 6. The shadow of his mother appeared in the hallway. 7. 8. If you've ever reached the point where you realized you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, hit the like button. Because I was at 9. And my hand was on the doorknob. I didn't wait for 10. I turned the handle and walked out. I didn't look to see if he was following. I didn't look to see if Margaret was standing there with those scissors. I walked down the grand staircase of the California mansion. I walked past the champagne glasses and the wilted flowers. I walked out the front door and into the gray, suffocating fog. I got into my car and started the engine. The sound was a roar in the silence of the morning. I put the car in gear. I looked in the rearview mirror. I saw the front door of the house open. A figure stood there. Small. Distant. Shrouded in the mist. It wasn't Ethan. It was Margaret. She was alone. I drove until the house was a memory. I drove until the sun finally broke through the clouds and turned the ocean into a sheet of hammered silver. I pulled over at a rest stop 3 hours north. I took out the diary. I looked at the confession. I looked at the defaced photos. I realized that my marriage hadn't ended that morning. It had never actually begun. It was a shell company. A front for a much darker transaction. I took a deep breath. The air was clean here. It didn't smell of old blood or expensive perfume. I picked up my phone and dialed the one number I had hoped I would never have to call. The line rang 3 times. A man's voice answered. It was deep. Professional. "This is Detective Vance," he said. I stared at the diary in my lap. I looked at the jagged edges of my own face on the floor mat. "My name is Claire Miller," I said. My voice didn't shake. "I have some information regarding the death of Arthur Miller. I think you'll find the discrepancies quite interesting." I hung up the phone. I looked at the road ahead. The audit was over. The truth was on the ledger. And for the first time in my life, the numbers finally added up to something that felt like freedom. I sat in the silence of my car for a long time after the line went dead. The hum of the heater was the only thing anchoring me to the present. I looked at the black leather diary. It was a ticking bomb. In the world of forensic accounting, we call it a smoking gun. But this was more than a paper trail. It was a roadmap of a shattered mind. I put the car back in gear and headed toward the police station. Every mile I put between myself and that coastal mansion felt like a layer of lead being lifted off my chest. I kept checking the rearview mirror. I expected to see the headlights of Ethan's silver sedan or the dark silhouette of Margaret's vintage town car. I expected the shadow to catch up. But the road remained empty. The fog had won. The police station was a brutalist block of concrete that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. I walked in with the diary tucked under my arm like a ledger of sins. Detective Vance was older than I expected. He had eyes that had seen every variation of human cruelty and stopped being surprised by it decades ago. I laid the diary on the scarred wooden table between us. I told him about the wedding night. I told him about the reddish-brown stain on the Egyptian cotton. I told him about the attic and the faceless photographs. Vance didn't interrupt. He flipped through the pages with a latex-gloved hand. When he reached the entry about the father's death, his jaw tightened. He looked up at me. "You realize what this is, Mrs. Miller?" he asked. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I wasn't Mrs. Miller anymore. I was just Claire. And what he was looking at was a confession of murder by omission. Vance explained the technicalities. The statute of limitations on a crime like this was a complex web of legal precedents. But the diary was new evidence. It was a contemporaneous record of intent. If Margaret had intentionally withheld aid or tampered with the vehicle, the case could be reopened as a homicide. If you've ever had to dismantle your own life to ensure justice was served, hit the like button. Because as I sat in that cold interrogation room, I wasn't just a bride. I was the star witness in a cold case that was suddenly running red hot. I signed the statement. I handed over the keys to the attic. I walked out into the afternoon sun feeling like a ghost. I had no home. No husband. No plan. I only had the truth. And the truth is a very cold bedfellow. I checked into a nondescript motel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where people go to disappear. The sheets were polyester and smelled of bleach. They were thin and scratchy. They were perfect. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my laptop. I began to look into the Miller estate. I started a deep dive audit of the family's offshore accounts. Margaret had been the sole executor of Arthur's will. She had inherited everything. But as I traced the flow of funds, I found a discrepancy. A monthly payment. $6,000. Every month for 16 years. The recipient was a shell company registered in Panama. The trail was buried under layers of corporate shielding. It was a classic embezzlement structure. But who was Margaret Miller paying to stay silent? The answer came at 3 a.m. I found a link to a private sanitarium in the foothills. A facility for long-term psychological care. I cross-referenced the dates. The payment started exactly 3 days after Arthur's funeral. I realized then that the accident wasn't the only secret Margaret was keeping. There was a third person in this equation. A witness. Or perhaps a victim who hadn't quite died. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the motel's air conditioning. I had pulled a thread, and the entire tapestry was coming apart. I wasn't just auditing a murder anymore. I was auditing a conspiracy of silence that spanned nearly 2 decades. I drove to the sanitarium at dawn. It was a gated estate surrounded by high stone walls and overgrown ivy. It looked more like a prison than a hospital. I used my maiden name at the front desk. I told them I was a representative from the Miller Estate's legal team. I used the jargon of a probate attorney. I talked about fiduciary duties and asset allocation. The receptionist didn't blink. She checked the ledger. "Room 402, she said. "He's had a quiet morning." My heart stopped. I walked down the sterile white hallway. The scent of antiseptic was overwhelming. I reached the door and took a breath. I pushed it open. The man in the bed was a hollowed-out version of the man in the photographs. His face wasn't cut out here. It was just gone. Replaced by a mask of scar tissue and vacant eyes. He was staring at the ceiling. He didn't turn when I entered. I walked to the side of the bed. "Arthur?" I whispered. The man's hand twitched. It was a small movement. A glitch in the system. I looked at his chart. Arthur Miller. Admitted October 14, 2010. Diagnosis: traumatic brain injury with permanent cognitive impairment. Status: ward of Margaret Miller. I realized the horror of it then. She hadn't just let him die. She had kept him alive in a cage. She had replaced him with a version of himself that couldn't leave. She had achieved the ultimate possession. I felt a presence in the doorway. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The jasmine and the gin had followed me. You always were too good at your job, Claire, Margaret said. She was standing there in her champagne dress. It was wrinkled now, stained with the dirt from the garden. She looked like a woman who had finally run out of time. She wasn't holding scissors this time. She was holding a small glass vial. Ethan's father didn't want to leave us, she said. Her voice was dreamy. Delusional. He just needed to be still. He needed to understand that we are a family. And now, you've brought the outside world into our sanctuary. You've broken the balance. She stepped into the room. Her eyes were fixed on the man in the bed. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He was a statue in her museum of control. If you've ever realized that the person you're facing has completely lost their grip on reality, hit the like button. Because Margaret wasn't seeing a hospital room. She was seeing a home. She was seeing the perfect end to her story. I backed away from the bed. I reached for my phone. But she was faster. She smashed the vial on the floor. A sharp, bitter almond scent filled the air. Cyanide. The auditor in me registered the chemical signature instantly. High concentration. Rapid onset. I scrambled for the door, but she blocked it. She was stronger than she looked. A lifetime of clutching had given her a grip like iron. We don't need anyone else, Claire, she hissed. The words from the back of the photograph. The motto of her madness. I could feel the fumes starting to burn my throat. My vision began to blur at the edges. I looked at Arthur. He was still staring at the ceiling. He was finally going to be free. I slumped against the wall. The world was spinning. The numbers were fading. The last thing I saw was Margaret lying down on the floor next to her husband. She was smiling. She was finally in control of the final audit. And then, the darkness took the rest of the page. The cold tile of the hospital floor was the last thing I felt before the world dissolved into a haze of bitter almonds and white noise. My lungs burned. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. I could see Margaret's silhouette through the thickening vapor. She was curled into a fetal position beside the bed of the man she had turned into a ghost. She looked peaceful. It was the peace of a black hole. Total. Absolute. Consuming everything in its reach. I tried to reach for the door handle, but my fingers felt like lead weights. I thought about the audit. I thought about the missing $6,000 a month. I thought about the fact that I had finally found the bottom of the Miller family ledger. And it was an abyss. The sound of shattering glass saved my life. It was a violent, percussive crack that cut through the silence. A heavy boot kicked in the door. Then came the shouting. Voices muffled by gas masks. I felt strong arms hook under my armpits and drag me across the floor. The air changed. The bitter scent of cyanide was replaced by the sharp, clean bite of the morning wind. I was on the grass. The sky was a bruising shade of purple. I coughed until my ribs felt like they were snapping. I looked up and saw Ethan. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a white coat. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He looked smaller. Older. He was kneeling in the dirt, vomiting. He had followed her. He had seen the final act of the woman who had built his world. If you've ever seen a person's entire reality crumble in the span of a single heartbeat, hit the like button. Because Ethan wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the sanitarium. He was looking at the room where his father had been a prisoner for 16 years. He was looking at the smoke rising from the broken window. He was a surgeon who had spent his life trying to stop the bleeding, and he had just realized he was the one holding the scalpel. I reached out and touched his hand. It was ice cold. He didn't pull away. He didn't even notice. He was catatonic. The golden boy was gone. There was only a shell left. The next 48 hours were a blur of oxygen masks and police statements. Detective Vance was there. He looked tired. He told me they had found Margaret. She was alive, but barely. The concentration of the gas hadn't been enough to kill her in the open space of the room, but the brain damage was significant. The irony was a jagged pill to swallow. She had ended up exactly like the husband she had tried to erase. A silent prisoner of her own design. Arthur Miller had passed away in the ambulance. His heart had simply stopped. Perhaps it was the fumes. Or perhaps it was the realization that the doors were finally open and he didn't have to stay anymore. I sat in the hospital cafeteria and watched the sun come up over the parking lot. I had a coffee in my hand. It was bitter and cheap. I loved it. I was alive. I was the survivor of a merger that should have killed me. I looked at the news on the television mounted in the corner. The headlines were already screaming. The Miller scandal. The bride who knew too much. The mother's dark secret. They were turning my trauma into a commodity. A story for people to consume over breakfast. I turned my back to the screen. I didn't want to be a story. I wanted to be an auditor again. I wanted to find the things that balanced. Ethan came to see me before I checked out. He was pale. His eyes were bloodshot. He sat across from me and didn't speak for a long time. He looked at his hands. The hands that saved lives. I didn't know, Claire, he whispered. I knew she was difficult. I knew she was intense. But I thought my father died on that road. I thought she was protecting me from the memory of it. I looked at him and I saw the tragedy of the good man. He had been complicit because he was kind. He had been a hostage because he was loyal. I told him that ignorance wasn't an excuse in an audit. It was just a different kind of liability. He asked me if I could ever forgive him. He asked if we could go back to the coast. Back to the jasmine and the promises. I looked at the man I had married 4 days ago. I realized I didn't even know the sound of his Real laugh. I only knew the sound of his obedience. I told him that the marriage was void. It was built on a fraudulent foundation. There was no recovery of assets here. There was only the liquidation. I stood up and left the coffee on the table. I walked out of the hospital and I didn't look back. I had a suitcase in my trunk and a bank account that Margaret couldn't touch. I was debt-free. I drove back to the coast one last time. Not to the mansion. I went to the cliffs where we had stood at the altar. The white flowers were still there. They were brown and shriveled now. They looked like trash. I walked to the edge of the drop. The Pacific was a deep, unforgiving blue. I took off my wedding ring. It was a flawless diamond. A symbol of eternal love. I looked at the way it caught the light. It was beautiful. It was also a lie. I threw it. I watched it disappear into the spray of the waves. It didn't make a sound. It was just gone. If you've ever had to walk away from everything you thought you wanted to save the person you actually are, hit the like button. Because as I stood on that cliff, I realized that the reddish-brown stain on the sheets wasn't the end of my life. It was the red ink on a bad investment. It was the warning sign I had finally chosen to heed. I went back to my car. I opened my laptop. I had work to do. There were other files to open. Other accounts to settle. I was Claire Miller, and I was the one who decided when the books were closed. I spent the next month in a small apartment in a city where nobody knew my name. I changed my phone number. I changed my hair. I went back to work. I spent my days in the quiet, orderly world of spreadsheets and tax codes. It was a relief to deal with numbers that stayed where you put them. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't try to poison you in the name of love. But every night, when I closed my eyes, I still smelled the jasmine. I still saw Margaret's eyes in the dark. The trauma wasn't a ledger you could just close. It was a recurring expense. One afternoon, a package arrived at my office. It was a thick manila envelope. No return address. I opened it with a letter opener. My hands were perfectly steady. Inside was a single photograph and a letter. The photograph was from the attic. It was the one of Ethan as an 8-year-old boy. But someone had taped a new piece onto it. A face. It was Arthur's face, taken from a different picture. It was a crude reconstruction. A desperate attempt to make the past whole again. I felt a surge of nausea. I knew who had sent it. The letter was short. It was written in a shaky, uncertain hand. It wasn't Margaret's sharp script. It was Ethan's. It said, "I'm trying to find the pieces. I'm trying to see what you saw. Please don't disappear." I stared at the photograph. I saw the tape. I saw the cracks. I realized that Ethan was still trying to audit a ghost. He was still trying to fix a heart that had been stopped for 16 years. I didn't cry. I didn't feel pity. I felt a cold, hard clarity. I walked to the shredder in the corner of the room. I fed the photograph in. I fed the letter in. I watched them turn into thin strips of nothing. I wasn't a piece of his puzzle. I was the person who had walked out of the frame. The sound of the shredder was a mechanical purr. It was the sound of a clean slate. I watched the last of Ethan's handwriting disappear into the bin. In my world, you don't reconcile a lost cause. You write it off. You take the tax hit and you move on to more viable assets. I sat back in my chair and looked out at the skyline. The city was a grid of light and shadow. A billion transactions happening every second. I was just one of them. But I was the one who survived the audit of a lifetime. I reached for my mouse and opened a new file. I had a client meeting in 20 minutes. A mid-sized tech firm with a leak in their procurement department. Simple. Clean. Logical. 3 weeks later, I was leaving the office late. The lobby was empty. The marble floors echoed with the click of my heels. I saw a figure standing near the glass doors. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I thought of the scissors. I thought of the cyanide. But as I got closer, I realized it was just a courier. He held a legal-sized envelope. He asked for Claire Miller. I took the envelope. I knew the weight of it. It was the weight of a final settlement. I went back to the elevators and headed to the roof. I needed the air. I needed to see the horizon before I opened the last chapter of the Miller legacy. The envelope contained a copy of Margaret's final medical report and a deed. She had passed away in the state facility. Respiratory failure. A quiet exit for a woman who had lived such a loud, violent lie. The deed was for the coastal mansion. It had been left to me. A final gift from the woman who tried to kill me. Or perhaps a final trap. If you've ever realized that some gifts are actually just a way to keep you tethered to a nightmare, hit the like button. I looked at the paper. The valuation was staggering. It was more money than I would earn in 3 lifetimes. It was the price of my silence. The price of my soul. I didn't call a realtor. I didn't call Ethan. I called a demolition crew. I spent the next morning in a hard hat, standing on the edge of the driveway where I had parked my car on my wedding day. The house looked different without the jasmine. It looked like a tomb. I watched the first wrecking ball swing. It hit the attic window. The glass that had rippled with the reflection of 1,000 faceless photos shattered into 1,000,000 diamond shards. I felt a vibration in my feet. A release of pressure. It was the sound of 16 years of secrets finally being crushed into dust. I stayed until the sun began to dip toward the water. The mansion was a pile of rubble and broken timber. The mahogany door was splintered. The marble foyer was gravel. I walked over to the spot where the master bedroom used to be. I looked down at the earth. The soil was dark. Rich. I took a small bag of wildflower seeds from my pocket. I scattered them over the wreckage. I didn't want a monument. I wanted a meadow. I wanted something that grew toward the light without needing to be possessed. I wanted to see what happens when you let the ground breathe. I saw a car pull up at the gates. It was a silver sedan. Ethan got out. He didn't come close. He stood by the gatehouse and looked at the ruins of his childhood. He looked at me. He didn't look angry. He looked relieved. He raised a hand in a small, tentative wave. It wasn't an invitation. It was a goodbye. I nodded back. We were two survivors of the same wreck, standing on opposite sides of the debris. There was nothing left to say. The audit was closed. The balance was zero. He got back in his car and drove away. I watched his taillights disappear around the bend of the cliff. I stayed on the cliff until the stars came out. The air was cold now. Sharp. It didn't smell like gin or perfume. It smelled like salt and wet earth. I felt a strange lightness in my limbs. I realized I hadn't been breathing properly for months. I took a deep breath. A real one. It didn't burn. It didn't taste like almonds. It tasted like the future. I walked back to my car. I didn't look at the rubble in the rearview mirror. I looked at the road ahead. I had a life to build. And this time, I was going to be the only architect. My name is Claire. I am 30 years old now. I live in a house with a lot of windows and no attic. My sheets are cotton and they are always white. I don't have a diary. I have a planner. I have a life that adds up. People ask me sometimes why I never remarried. They ask if I'm lonely. I tell them I've already had my one great love. And I've already had my one great war. I tell them that I've learned the most important lesson an auditor can ever learn. You can't fix a broken heart with a contract. You can only fix it by walking away from the table. If you've listened to my story this far, hit the like button. It tells me that there are others out there who know that the hardest thing to do isn't staying. It's leaving. It's choosing yourself when the world tells you to choose someone else. I'm fine now. I'm more than fine. I'm balanced. I'm clear. I'm the one who survived the wedding night that never ended. And as I drive home tonight, under the wide, open sky, I know that the only person who will ever be in my bed is the person I choose to be there. And that is the only legacy I ever intend to leave behind. I passed the city limits and felt the familiar hum of the road. I thought about the reddish-brown stain on the silk. I thought about the woman who thought she could own a person. I thought about the man who let her try. They are just ghosts now. Figures in a ledger that has been settled and filed away. I turned on the radio. A song came on. Something upbeat. Something new. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel. I was driving toward the sunrise. I was driving toward a day that belonged entirely to me. The audit was over. The books were closed. And for the first time in my life, I was completely, beautifully, and finally out of debt.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.